At this point in your studies, this should be review. So, as a reminder, all organisms are made of cells. There are prokaryotic cells with no nucleus or eukaryotic cells that do have a nucleus. All cells also contain organelles, which are structures within the cells that perform specific and also special functions. And today, we're going to go deep dive into the different organelles, what they do, and in what cells they are found in. Our focus, and essentially our learning goals, is for each organelle, we will discuss its function or role and the cells they are found in. So, we're going to be specifically talking about prokaryotic, eukaryotic, and within eukaryotic, talking about plants or animals. Now, remember, some fungi and protists are eukaryotes too, but we're not focusing on those today. Alrighty, first on the list, we have the cell membrane. By far, probably the most important one. If you go into biology, this will be a major study. It is also known as the plasma membrane. You'll learn why it's called that when we go into deeper dives, but for now, just know that it's found, in fact, in all cells. On the left here is a prokaryotic cell. Over here is a plant cell, and here is an animal cell. These two being, of course, eukaryotic. So, keep in mind, when we say where are they found, you now find out they're both plant and animals and prokaryotic cells. The function is to maintain homeostasis by controlling what enters and leaves the cells. It also serves protection, but for now, all we're listing for you is homeostasis. The next, organelle. It is not really technically an organelle by a strict definition. However, we're going to consider it as one of the major parts of the cell. It's kind of like when we discuss blood as a tissue. We don't think of tissue as something that's free flowing, but cytoplasm is extremely important. It's the major reason cells are able to exist, right? You need something inside to help you flow. It's essentially their blood. So it's a gel-like substance inside of a cell. Whenever you're looking under a microscope and you see a cell, you can actively see that if ever their membrane is broken, that a gel-like liquid starts flowing out, especially if you can track where all those organelles are. Now, this is found in all cells. Again, plant and animal, as well as prokaryotic cells. The function is that it suspends organelles and provides an environment for chemical reactions within the cell. Next up, we have ribosomes. Ribosomes are generally, and I don't know who came up with this, but they are usually colored as little purple circles inside of cells. Sometimes pinkish or like a salmon color, but they're always painted as these tiny little like reddish, purplish colors. I don't know who came up with that, but that's just usually found in textbooks. Just so you know, in real life, that's not their actual color. That's just something we decided on as humans and it stuck. Now, these are found, again, in all cells, prokaryotic, eukaryotic. You might be noticing a reason Mr. Vo is organizing these the way they are to hopefully help you memorize these. Their function is to help make proteins. This is complicated because when we talk about protein synthesis in the future, you'll realize that it's not the only one. But for now, just remember that it helps make proteins. And then, again, not an organelle by a strict definition, however, is a very major important part of the cell, the cytoskeleton. This is a network of proteins found throughout the entire cell. It's usually invisible to us when we look at these diagrams. It's kind of assumed that it's there. Think of it like the cell's skeleton. There is, in fact, a hidden structure in there that holds everything in a specific spot. It is generally fluid, but it helps hold them in relation to each other. And when you study more into cells, you have to remember that there are these connecting tubes, okay? For now, just remember that they're found in only eukaryotic cells, plants and animals. The function for these is that it helps create the shape of the cell as well as movement of the organelle. So if they need to get somewhere else or if they need to start, changing their shape, think of it as almost acting like muscles. And now we're going to dive into what we classically called organelles. These are membrane bound organelles, and this is what I mean by the stricter sense. Some people will define organelles by saying they're only very distinct structures that you can see because they have a membrane around them. And so, because they are membrane bound organelles, This is one of those distinguishing factors between prokaryotic and eukaryotic cells. Eukaryotic cells, being what we consider evolutionarily more advanced, will have more complex structures, and therefore anything that's membrane bound or more complex structured, generally we think of as eukaryotic. Now, you should be remembering this whole list as only between plant versus animal. So again, plant is the green one to help you memorize it, and animal is the salmon colored pinkish one. Okay. The nucleus is surrounded by a nuclear membrane. So it actually has its own membrane, and it's so specific we call it a nuclear membrane. We find this in both plants and animals. The function for this is to store genetic information, your DNA. This by far is probably the most important part. So important that technically prokaryotes have some version of this, but we don't call it a nucleus because it doesn't have a membrane. But shh, we're not talking about that yet. The function, again, is that it stores genetic information, and there is in fact an area inside called the nucleolus, and this is where it makes ribosomes. Next up, we have the endoplasmic reticulum, specifically the rough one. So you will see that there are different kinds of ERs. It's short for endoplasmic reticulum. There will be a smooth and a rough one. This one is rough because, if you'll notice the structure over here, it seems to be completely covered in small black dots. In this case, those are actually ribosomes. So remember the little purple dots I was talking about before? They're actually over here. In some diagrams, you'll see them actually still colored the same way they would be in the cytoplasm. But over here instead, they are colored black just to make it easier to draw. These are found in both plants and animals. The function is to make and transport proteins. This takes us, of course, then to the smooth endoplasmic reticulum, the SER. This is found again in both plants and animals. Of course, eukaryotic cells. I'm just talking about plants and animals at this point. The function is to make lipids and membranes. This also helps. We'll go into detail, but here are some examples of what they do. It detoxifies in the liver and can store calcium in the muscle. This is when you get into deep anatomy, but just for now, just remember that they're making lipids and membranes. That's the most important aspect. Understand that there are further functions. For now, we won't discuss it. And then we have the Golgi body, also known as the Golgi apparatus. This is found in both plants and animals. The function is to modify, sort, and ship proteins. This is a very vague thing. The way I like to think about it is that Golgi bodies are the UPS of the cell. They receive a lot of parts, especially proteins that are mostly done, if not completely done, and then they sit there and change it, make sure it's packaged, ready to go, and then they categorize them. Okay, these go into this row, into that box, into this shipping, and then they move them to where they need to go. Proteins sometimes need to go outside of the cell, so they package them for that. Other times they need to go inside of the cell, to say, for example, specifically to the mitochondria or to the cytoplasm or just anywhere, and they have to figure out how to ship them. So think of Golgi body as the UPS. You can also see that over here, the function that we mentioned specifically is that the proteins go everywhere, right? And the next one, this one was the most memed organelle in the millennial generation, mitochondria, powerhouse of the cell. The mitochondrion is singular, just FYI, and mitochondria means there's many of them. So don't get confused if I say mitochondrion in any of the passages we see for the FRQs. These are found in all eukaryotic cells again. The function is to create energy. This is why they're called the powerhouse, because they literally create power. And this is ATP from foods. Ignore the part about foods for now. Just know that they create energy, because it can be a little confusing when I say they're creating it from food. The site of cellular respiration, remember we talked about this briefly in some of our passages, it's mentioned. It's the opposite of photosynthesis, where you take glucose and oxygen and you create energy, and the byproducts being carbon dioxide and water. This is where it happens. It's inside of mitochondria. And now, a very specialized one. Sometimes people forget this one exists because it is not one of the major players. It is, however, found in both plants and animals. Peroxisomes are similar to smooth ER, and their function is to detox cells from dangerous chemicals. It's similar to metabolism in mitochondria, but peroxisomes are. It gets complicated. It depends on which cells and when you're discussing them, but just think of them as detox. That's the easiest way to remind this. Any of you who've ever used hydrogen peroxide to help clean a wound, think of it that way, and that will help you understand what peroxisomes are. And then there's a vacuole. Sounds like the word vacuum, and that's because it is relatively related. These are found in both plant and animal cells. However, it is very usually associated with plants. Keep in mind, it's both, and plants do have a specialized one that we'll discuss further. But the function is to store food, water, or wastes within the cell. In particular, with plants we'll talk about, water becomes an incredible element of this. So keep that in mind. And now, the lysosome. Lysosomes are found only in animal cells. There may be a few in plants, but we will only discuss it as if it was in animals. Lysosomes, again, I don't know why. They're always also shown as just a bigger circle. You remember the ribosomes, the little purple dots? Lysosomes are either colored also major purple or blue, but sometimes this pinkish color. It's just a color you start associating when you see too many of these diagrams. Anyway, that's a random aside. Again, not the real color of lysosomes, just a random point Mr. Tong decided to say. The function for these are to use enzymes to digest bacteria, viruses, and old organelles. Another cool thing, don't use this, this is the definition that we're going to talk about, but lysosomes are sometimes filled with acid. And it's almost like it's the stomach of the cell. It's not entirely, don't take that as the actual thing. This is why I'm saying as a small random aside, but they are in fact filled with acid. Now, old cell parts are recycled using these guys. So if you have an old ribosome that's just not working anymore, it's broken, it will in fact go into the lysosome to get melted down. So the enzymes break it down to pieces and recycle the bits. You then have centrosome and centrioles. Now, these contain centrioles. They're found in animal cells only, and the function is to create specialized structures called spindle fibers that will be used in cell division. And they're usually drawn like this because the spindle fibers are usually just sitting there and they just start growing them longer and longer and they become this like really, really like long tentacle jellyfish looking things. And then we have the cell wall. These are found only in plants. You can actually find them in prokaryotic cells as well. Very interestingly, they don't have a cell membrane, but they'll have a cell wall. And also in fungi and I'm not going to even try to say that. My brain's not working. The rigid structure outside of a cell membrane. These provide shape, structure, and protection of the cell. Sounds incredibly similar to the cell membrane. So I'm going to provide a little bit of a difference for the two. Cell membrane is very flexible, and oftentimes a lot of things can pass through it. The cell wall, however, makes it much harder for things to get through. Much more difficult. It actually creates a very solid barrier. And the cell wall often gives plant cells such an easy way to stay in the same shape. It creates relatively tough material. So if you ever see something that has very tough material, there's something else other than a cell membrane going on. Again, this was not strictly an organelle because now we have something that's outside of the cell. This is why it's called extracellular. It's like extracurricular. It means it's outside of your normal cell or is outside of your normal curriculum. And there's a matrix. It looks like it's a bunch of threads. It's like a crosshatch outside. There's an extra layer outside of the wall of the cell membrane and the cell wall. These are found only in eukaryotic cells, and there's a reason, because prokaryotes often aren't multicellular. Eukaryotes are, and therefore they tend to work together in tissues and whatever else, and so they need something to hold them together. That's what this extracellular matrix is. Its function is to allow for adhesion, support, and it regulates cell behavior by helping them make sure they go where they're supposed to, as well as keep them where they're supposed to be. Think about it like if you have a team for soccer or for basketball, a point guard, for example, kind of needs to make sure that they're on their side of the court and not running around doing, something else. And then we have the chloroplast. These are found in plant cells. Now, there are some eukaryotes like algae, also some bacteria that sometimes have, strangely, uh, chloroplast or things like it in it. For now, just think of it as plant cells. These are the specialty of plant cells. You find them in nearly every plant. Again, when you hear me saying like almost, it's because I've studied too much into this stuff, and there are some plants that have either a lacking amount of them. Because you're saying plant cells, you have to remember not all plant cells are doing what leaves do. But as a beginner, as an intro, remember that this is a specialty of plants, which is why we're going to say, hey, just focus on it being plant cells for now. When you study further into biology, you see that it's not always the case, but it's so much so, you might as well think of it like that now. Now, the function is this is the site of photosynthesis. Photosynthesis is one of the most amazing processes on Earth. Till now, we as humans have not been able to do what photosynthesis can do. We've copied it, but we're only, I think, at best 30% effective. Last I checked, maybe it's gone up to something higher, but solar panels cannot do the amount of energy conversion that photosynthesis can. It takes direct energy from the sun, literally the light from the sun, and turns it into sugar. We call it just food here, but it's literal glucose. That's really crazy to think about. Now, this is what Mr. Vo was mentioning when we said we talk about it later. The central vacuole. This is a monstrously large organelle. You'll almost always see it, and it becomes very obvious if you look at it under a microscope. These are found primarily in plant cells. We're going to say only plant cells in this course, but it's primarily plant cells. The function is that it stores water in order to maintain plant shape. Um, think of it like a gigantic bag of water that just holds everything in place. It just pushes everything to its limits. And that's generally what these central vacuoles do. So one way to think about it is you take out things like, any leaf and you leave it for a while, it doesn't have water that you're feeding it, it starts wilting, right? The reason is because there's not enough water. And because there's not enough water, that central vacuole doesn't have enough to fill out the shape. And therefore, it starts shrinking and shrinking because it's literally just losing water. I just have to make a comment, as usual, that flagella is not a strictly, in a sense, an organelle, but in this case, we're going to consider it as part of that. Flagella is a specialized set of, if you will, cytoskeleton. They are found on the outside of a cell. So when they say found in, we're not talking about the actual location. We're talking about whether they're prokaryotic or eukaryotic. And they're found in both. The function is to help a cell move. It literally is thrown back and forth in an almost engine-like rhythmic pattern, and that causes it to almost to propel it. And so you will find it in cells that need to move from one place to another. It is most commonly found in prokaryotes or single-cell organisms because those cells are actual just living organisms on their own. They need to move around place to place. A lot of parasites that make it into your blood, some things like amoebas or whatever else, they need to move. Now, amoebas have another interesting way to move, but some of those protists have this flagellum. Bacterias often will have something like a flagellum. So keep that in mind. That's what flagellum is for. Obviously, we just covered a whole lot of information. So there is an exercise in class that will be helping you with memorizing this. Otherwise, please make sure to remember to think about using Quizlets as well as flashcards to help you just memorize every last bit of information. The other important aspect, just as a quick note, is always to remember, well, what information are you even covering? You can't just remember, oh, well, what's this organelle do and what's that organelle do? You have to be able to list all the organelles out. So consider one of the data points as just memorizing what organelles there are, how many there are, and it doesn't really matter the order, but just remember that there are that many and you can name all of them.